Brothers and sisters, over the past 5.5 years, the Postal Service has lost $32 billion. Most of this loss, 85% of it, is due to the pre-funding burden that was placed upon us by Congress. But even if we didn't have that burden, we would be facing a crisis at the Postal Service. The core business of the Postal Service is being eaten away by electronic diversion. Now, the Postal Service is recklessly accelerating the exit of first-class mail by slashing service and by degrading the value of the mail. And the crisis created by the pre-funding burden is driving postal management to make disastrously counterproductive decisions. But we would face a long-term crisis no matter what. It's the same crisis that's facing the music industry, the newspaper industry, the book publishing industry, and countless others. Digitalization of paper-based communications. It's a dramatic demonstration of how unique our situation is and how critical the crisis facing the Postal Service is that we even let the next speaker in the convention hall, let alone invited him to speak to you. He is now the Vice President of U.S. Investment Banking of Lazard, one of the leading investment banks in the world. In the good old days, he would be treated as enemy number one, or at least someone to be very wary of. He's now our trusted advisor as we confront our new reality. My, how the world turns. NALC retained Ron last September after he left the Obama administration, serving as the car czar, I know he loves that term, that restructured and saved the American auto industry. Before that, he had served as special assistant to the president of the Steelworkers Union and was directly responsible for restructuring the steel industry. And before that, he had been an investment banker with Lazard and co-founded his own boutique investment company. He started out his working life as a union organizer for SEIU before going to Harvard Business School. When Ron came on board, we made it clear to him that we wanted a detailed review of the Postal Service, and then his honest, unvarnished opinion of whether the United States Postal Service was able to be salvaged, and if so, how. Ron made it clear that we might not like everything he had to say after he conducted his review, but that he would give it to us straight. And that's what he's going to do this morning. What we do with his advice and his recommendation is up to us. It's up to all of us. But I urge you to put down your iPhones, close your booklets, and listen carefully. This is not swing room talk. This is not happy talk. This is cold, hard reality and what we can do about it. So at this time, I want to introduce Mr. Ron Bloom.
Thank you, Fred. It's great to be here. I'm not quite sure what to do with that introduction. You know, I read Fred's speech from yesterday, and so I think what I really ought to do is just say, I agree with that guy, and get off the stage. But I flew all the way out here, so let me spend a few minutes talking about the Postal Service and the challenges I believe it faces and the challenges that this union faces. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here. You know, I started hanging around the NALC last fall, and your general counsel, Bruce Simon, said to me, you know, I don't know whether they're going to like you and you're going to like them, but if you are able to work something out with them, I hope it can last through the summer, because you really ought to come to their convention. It is really something to behold. And your general counsel was right. This is really an extraordinary gathering, and it's really neat to be here. I want to start by talking about history a little bit. Not because I think we ought to live in the past, but because I think we can learn from the past. And I want to talk a little bit about my history. Again, not because it's particularly interesting what I've done, but I want to try to share some of the lessons I've learned in the work I've done through the years. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Postal Service and some of the lessons that we can learn from that. So let me start with a little bit of history. I had the privilege to attend college, and after I finished college, I moved to Boston and was hanging around, not doing too much. My parents were calling each week and wondering why they'd spent all this money to send me to college, when I met a guy who was the president of a large local union of the Service Employees International Union. And this local represented people who worked in the city of Boston, including a large public hospital in the city called Boston City Hospital. And this guy said to me, after seeing me in a few meetings, he said, you know, you got a loud mouth, you're a smart ass, and you don't back down. Why don't you come work for us? And given that my other employment prospects were not great, I signed up to work for the Service Employees Union. I had a bit of a baptism by fire. Shortly after joining the union, the local found itself on strike in the city of Boston, again representing the city hall workers and the municipal hospital workers. And the strike was about two things. The first thing it was about was that in those days, if you worked for the city of Boston, you were expected, as a condition of employment, to join in the political campaigns to re-elect the mayor. And this was an unspoken but clear rule. If you wanted to get promoted, if you wanted to get ahead, no matter how good a job you did or didn't do on the job, the real measure of whether or not you got ahead was how you participated in the political organization. Now, some of the members liked the mayor, some of them didn't like the mayor, but all of them felt that it was completely inappropriate that they had to come to work and do a hard day's work for a fair day's pay and then be asked to participate in politics. And so part of the strike was a demand that that kind of activity be prohibited and people be judged either on seniority or on merit, but not based on their politics. And the second demand of the strike was that over the recent past, services had been being degraded at the municipal hospital. Now, at that time, this was a public hospital serving less privileged, poor people in the city of Boston, and the city had been cutting back services there, and so the union stood up and said, this is a great and important institution for the city of Boston. It needs to be well-funded and adequately staffed. Now, the union won that strike. Staffing patterns were changed at the municipal hospital, and patronage and the rules regarding patronage were changed so that people were not required to work as a condition of having their job. From that experience, I learned an interesting lesson. I learned that first, when a union stands up for dignity and respect, that it winds up standing up for the people it serves. And so this strike and the two things that it were about were really what the union was about. That when a union says, we have the right to have dignity in the workplace, we need to be treated with respect, they wind up standing up for all of the people in the public entity for which they work. So I did that for about 5 years, and then I decided I wanted to go to business school. And the reason I did that was in the course of my work for the service employees, it became clear to me that very few people in the labor movement at that time really understood the way businesses worked. So unions were terrific at advocating for their members. They were able to, if they had the leverage or the power, they were able to get good deals, but they really couldn't understand the business for which they were working. And so oftentimes there was a dialogue between the company and the union of people talking past each other. And I decided that it would be interesting to try to actually understand how business works. not particularly be sympathetic or unsympathetic, but to understand it, so the union could be an educated bargainer. And so I applied to business school. At the time I was living in Boston, so I applied to Harvard. The real story, of course, is I couldn't get into law school, so I decided I'd go to business school. And I wrote this terrific application. Harvard, at the time, Harvard at the time let in about 800 people each year. So I wrote this application. I said, you know, you let 799 business-oriented folks in, you ought to balance it out with a union guy. And they let me in. Now, and from that I learned, be who you are. Don't pretend to be what you're not, be who you are, say what you believe, and oftentimes it works out okay. So I graduated from the business school and I went to work on Wall Street, and I found this very interesting firm called Lazard Frere & Co. And at the time, Lazard was the premier advisory firm representing large companies who were engaged in one sort or another of corporate transaction. And so this was a real opportunity to learn how business worked. At the same time, however, Lazard had also made a business representing public entities and more recently labor unions. So I spent a number of years there and had an extraordinary apprenticeship where I could both really learn the craft of what business was about, but also serve unions. And so I worked for the steelworkers, the auto workers, Teamsters, and others, as they were facing a series of crises that were challenging their employers. I left there and founded my own firm called Kalin & Bloom, where I was for another 5 years. As you can see from this story, I have a little trouble holding a job. And our firm was really founded on the principle that unions needed sophisticated financial advice, and since we couldn't provide them sophisticated advice, at least we provided them advice. But that was our story. And I did that and did that for 5 years as well. During the course of my work there, I got to know the folks at the Steelworkers Union. They were the union that we served more than any other. And in January of '96, I had the opportunity to go work for the Steelworkers, and I was there for a while. And in that time, the thing that Fred mentioned that I want to talk about this morning was that the union was involved in the restructuring of the United States steel industry, the American steel industry. Now, in the year 2000 or thereabouts, the United States steel industry was literally on the verge of extinction. Years and years of mismanagement and unfair imports had driven the companies, almost all of them, to be financially non-viable. And one by one, the great American steel companies were literally walking off a cliff. They were going into bankruptcy because they had debts they couldn't pay, and there was no prospect of them emerging from bankruptcy. They were led by management who didn't want to win anymore. They were led by management who really had come to believe that their job was to lose slowly. They were led by people who had concluded that we simply couldn't make steel in America anymore, and therefore the best that we could do was to simply retreat and retreat and retreat, maybe you've seen this story, and shrink to survive and hold on and hope that the end would come a little later than it otherwise might. And that was really where the American steel industry was going. Well, the union looked at that, and for a while, and for a long time, the union, to be candid, had gone along for the ride. The Steelworkers Union had terrific labor agreements, and while those who are from Michigan will argue that auto worker agreements were better, those of us from Pittsburgh would say that the steelworkers had the best agreements in the private sector of industrial workers. Best wages, working conditions, pensions, rights on the job, terrific labor agreements. But unfortunately, if your company fails, if your company goes out of business, there's nothing that your terrific labor agreement can do except cushion a piece of the blow. You can have as much of the pie as you want. If there's no pie at all, you go hungry. And so the union decided that it needed to step up. The union decided, in the words of its president at the time, Lynn Williams, that management was too important to be left to management. And so the union decided to step up and try to lead the restructuring of the American steel industry. And it did it in 5 different arenas. First, it led the political charge against unfair imports. It said that it's fine that steel be a globally traded commodity, but if it's going to be traded, it should be traded on a level playing field. And if other countries are subsidizing their steel industries, we can't let that steel come in and destroy the American steel industry. Second, the union took a hard look at its collective bargaining agreement. And this was an extremely difficult and painful process. The steelworkers, like your union, is a very democratic union, so everyone appropriately wants the right to be heard. But the message that was taken to the members is, reasonable as the things we've achieved are, fair as they are, hard-fought as they are, the companies for which we work are going out of business. And if we keep doing the same things we've always done, that decline, that end, will be inevitable. And so the union took a hard look and asked its members to make some very difficult and painful sacrifices in the collective bargaining agreements. Third, the union stepped out of its traditional collective bargaining role and involved itself in the operational and financial restructuring of these companies. Because, listening to President Williams, they understood that if that process was left to a management who was old and tired and bureaucratic and didn't want to win, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work, and it wouldn't matter what sacrifices were made in the collective bargaining agreement. Because you could make all those sacrifices, but if the company didn't want to succeed in the marketplace, if it wasn't led by people who wanted to win, then all those sacrifices would go for naught. And so the union involved itself in the financial and operational restructuring of the industry. The union involved itself in the very structure of the steel industry, helping to facilitate mergers between companies so that they could get economies of scale and be successful businesses so they could pay decent wages. So that these sacrifices could be restored when the companies returned to health, you needed a healthy company to do that. And finally, the union went out and recruited management. The union said, we need great leaders. We need people who want to win. We need people who know how to make steel and who want to win in the marketplace. And through all those activities, the steel industry in America was saved. Now, like all victories, it's not permanent. The steel industry continues to face enormous challenges, global competition and other. But by the union standing up, they changed the course of history. And without the intervention of the union, there would not be an integrated steel industry in America today, and with their intervention, there is. Now, from that process, I learned a few things. First, things change. In the end of World War II, Bethlehem Steel employed 300,000 people. Today, Bethlehem Steel does not exist. In the end of the 1960s, there were 750,000 members in what the union called its Basic Steel Industry Conference. When the crisis hit in 2000, that number literally could have gone to 0. So things that we believe, and if you'd grown up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or in the Lehigh Valley, or in Homestead, Pennsylvania, you would have believed that the existence of these companies and their future, it had to be there. You can't imagine an America without a steel industry. Well, what we learned as we faced this crisis in 2000 is you can. You can. It didn't have to turn out this way. There could have been the end of integrated steel making in America. So things that we believe are permanent, things we're sure of that are kind of almost as if they've come from heaven, they're not. They don't. Things can change. Second thing we learned was that the union can change, the union can lead change, and that if the union doesn't stand up for the industry, nobody will. Because at the end of the day, nobody cares more about these institutions than the people who work for them. Management comes and goes. In the case of private companies, shareholders come and go. Suppliers come and go, customers come and go. And there's nothing wrong with any of that, but that's the nature of it. The workers are left always there. And we used to say that regarding a steel mill that we can't go home, we are home. There's no place to go. And so not only can the union lead change, the union must lead change. Because if the union doesn't stand up for the institution, it cannot expect that anybody else will. So I worked for the steelworkers for a while and applied some of those lessons I'd learned to other industries as well, paper, rubber, aluminum, and others. And then in 2008, if people remember back to that time, the American economy was falling apart. In fact, the global economy was falling apart. And the one part of it that was falling apart that was most kind of significant to me was the imminent demise of General Motors. Now, I thought at the time, and I still think at the time, that the steel industry is a pretty important thing. But the American automobile industry really sits at the top of the pyramid of the entire manufacturing economy. There's almost nothing we make in America, some part of which doesn't find its way into a car. So whether it's steel, or whether it's aluminum, or whether it's plastic, or whether it's glass, or whether it's semiconductors, the entire manufacturing and economy in America, a piece of almost every part of it goes into the car. And General Motors faced extinction. And like Bethlehem Steel before it, and National Steel and LTV, people had believed for a long, long time that General Motors could never go out of business. General Motors all by itself once employed 1 million people. How could General Motors not exist? General Motors is part of the fabric of America. Well, in late 2008, the Congress of the United States was prepared to see General Motors liquidate. The Congress of the United States would not approve emergency assistance. The company was out of money. They were literally kiting checks. And if steps had not been taken to provide emergency assistance, General Motors would have literally ceased to exist. And so seeing that situation, and based on what I'd been doing for the prior 25 years, I said, I need to try to be part of that. I have to try to help to save this company, not for the company, but for the tens and tens of thousands of Americans whose livelihoods, directly or indirectly, are connected to that company, and to the dozens and dozens of communities. And so I talked my way onto the President's Auto Task Force and was involved in the restructuring of General Motors and Chrysler and the American automobile industry. And again, I think we can look at that now with a little hindsight and say that it was extraordinarily successful. These companies were saved. These companies were saved. They are now growing again. They are winning in the marketplace. And the same things that I had learned as I'd worked on the restructuring of the steel industry, I was able to apply to the restructuring of the automobile industry. The other thing I learned in my experience with General Motors is that government can act, and it can act for the good. Good people from diverse perspectives can come together and do the right thing for the greater good. And that's what happened. And that can happen. It is possible for government, which is so under assault today. People reject the very notion that government can be a force for good in our lives. And I think the General Motors restructuring is Exhibit A, that the government acted decisively and aggressively to bring order where there was chaos, to insist on sacrifice from all stakeholders, not unequally falling on one group or the other, and to save these companies, again, not so the companies could be saved, but so all the people who depended on them would have a place to work. So after working for the president for 2.5 years, I was commuting. I live in Pittsburgh, and the job was obviously in Washington. And I have younger kids. I decided it was time to go home. 2.5 years of back and forth was enough. And so about a year ago, I left the administration. And the last year, I've done 3 important things. First, I've spent time with my kids, and my wife, which is probably the most important thing I've done. Second thing, I got to meet the NALC and got a trip to Minnie out of it. And third, I've decided to rejoin the firm that I worked for 25 years ago, Lazard. A lot of the people who were juniors when I was there the first time around are now in positions of responsibility running the firm. One of the guys said to me, you know, the inmates have taken over the asylum. You really ought to come back. And so I said yes. So I've gone back to work at Lazard. And chief among the challenges I took on, but first when I was in my recuperation phase, and now continuing on in my role at Lazard, is going to be to try to help the National Association of Letter Carriers look at the problems facing the Postal Service. Now, I must confess, I felt a little cocky when we did the GM thing. I said that was pretty cool, we got that done. It is true that looking at the problems of the Postal Service, General Motors looks like a gimme. It's a big problem. So you all seem relatively supportive of me so far, so I'm leaving. Let me turn next to a sort of idiosyncratic view of 3 moments in the Postal Service history that have lessons for us. Now, in this room, I suspect a lot of people are way better. I know almost everyone's a better historian of the Postal Service than I am, so I'll try not to screw this up too badly. I want to start with our nation's first postmaster. And I assume everyone knows that he was the first postmaster. Everybody may not know that he was actually the Postmaster General for the Crown in the 1750s, before there was America. And Franklin was relieved of his role for, quote, actions sympathetic to the cause of the colonies. Now that's a PMG you could rally around. So in 1775, when the Continental Congress met, it created the post office and named Franklin the first Postmaster General. Now, I think the Founding Fathers had it right. The first thing they did was establish a postal service. The second thing they did was hire a great guy to run it, and then they decided to found a country. So I think they had a pretty good strategy. Our Founding Fathers understood something. They understood and embedded in the fabric of our nation was the understanding that to create a nation, we needed a reliable system for government to communicate with the citizens, citizens to communicate with each other, and businesses to communicate with their customers. And so they created this thing called a postal service. And as our nation grew, so did the post office. The next little vignette comes from 1912, 100 years ago. when the Congress decided for the first time to let the Postal Service deliver packages. Now, in the period just before, as the nation was growing, the demand for the reliable delivery of packages had been growing with it. But unfortunately, a lot of the companies that sprang up to meet the need were unscrupulous and took advantage of both the shippers and the public. And so Congress, recognizing the huge natural advantage that the Postal Service's network provided, allowed the Postal Service to enter into this market, thus reducing prices, increasing reliability, and perhaps most importantly, giving a huge boost to the overall economy. Imagine that, a Congress who actually saw that a growing and prosperous Postal Service could be good for our nation. Finally, I want to mention events that many in this room witnessed firsthand and some played a lead role in. Now, this is obviously dangerous ground because the first two, there's a history book, who knows what really happened. We've actually got people here who know something, so I'm going to tread very carefully. But I do want to try to make a point about what happened in the late 60s and in 1970 in the Postal Service. So in the late 60s, as everyone knows, the Postal Service was malfunctioning on a massive scale. Interestingly, while the mail was stuck in Chicago and elsewhere, the people who delivered it had the privilege of serving their nation during the day and stopping by the welfare office on the way home to pick up the food stamps to which their miserly wages entitled them. And so letter carriers stood up. They stood up for themselves, demanding the right to bargain and the better wages, hours, and working conditions that it would bring. And they stood up for the Postal Service, demanding that Congress allow it to do its job without the suffocating interference that had become the norm. And it worked. At least for a while, the Postal Reform Act and the collective bargaining rights it brought allowed the Postal Service to focus on delivering the mail and allowed the unions representing its workers to focus on beginning the long process of giving letter carriers and other postal workers a fair day's pay for their hard work. Now, what are the lessons we can learn from that history, from the three little vignettes that I shared with you? I think that history teaches us the three things we need to have a successful Postal Service. First thing from Franklin, you need a leader with vision who wants the Postal Service to win. From the events of 1912, you need a Congress who sees the value of the network and knows that by allowing the Postal Service to fill the network, everyone will do better. And from the events of 1970, I think we learned that if letter carriers don't stand up for themselves and this institution, nobody will. But when they do stand up, extraordinary things can happen. Now I want to try to take that history, both mine and the Postal Service, and see if we can apply it to the events of today. And as Fred said, I'm going to share with you some very, very difficult, and I won't call them truths because there aren't truths here, but the things I have learned as I've had a chance to study the Postal Service. And as Fred said, this is my advice, these are my views. You are free to take them or reject them. But I don't think it's valuable for the union to bring someone in from the outside, whatever his credentials are or her credentials are, and not have them tell it to you straight. This is a large democratic assemblage. You have the wisdom amongst yourselves to take what's told to you by anyone who brings it, to sort it out with your personal experience and knowledge and figure out what to do with it. But I'm going to try to share with you my unvarnished view of the situation facing the United States Postal Service. I believe that today the Postal Service faces a crisis as significant as any in its storied history. Put simply, Congress set up the Postal Service to be a self-sustaining institution, and on that basis, the Postal Service is going out of business. On its current trajectory, while it will probably take a while, there will come a day when the United States Postal Service is reduced to a tiny shadow of its former self. Within a decade, we could easily see mail delivered 2 to 3 days a week to a central location where people in a neighborhood or a community go to pick it up. The basic facts of the Postal Service are dire and dramatic, and this institution, like Bethlehem Steel before it and General Motors 3 years ago, does not have a God-given place in our nation. The Congress created it, and whether by action or inaction, indifference or malice, many people are prepared to see it fade away. Let's look at the 3 elements of why the crisis is as deep as it is. And there is, unfortunately, deep and significant bad news to share. First, the core product that the Postal Service uses to support itself is in long-term decline, with almost no hope of it not occurring. First-class mail, whether it's declining at 5% a year or 6% a year or maybe 4% a year, is in long-term decline. And I see nothing on the horizon that will arrest that decline. Now, it's not going to go to zero. There are still portions of our population who don't communicate electronically, but most of that population is the shrinking part of the population, is people who are older, and so who will not be here forever. And the acceleration to substitute electronic communication for written communication, for paper communication, is relentless. So the basic product, which for 100 years has been the core product of the Postal Service, that provides it with the overwhelming majority of its revenue and its gross margin, or its profit before its fixed costs, is in long-term decline to a number. And again, I have no particular wisdom on this, but we've looked at a lot of different forecasts, and whether it first class in a decade declines to 20% of its current size or 30% or 15% honestly doesn't really matter. With that sort of decline, the basic economics of the Postal Service are going to force it to collapse. The second piece of bad news is the entity that's responsible for setting up and maintaining the Postal Service, the United States Congress. While it has many good people in it who both get it and don't want it to happen, who understand the value of the Postal Service, what it means to so many people, and who understand what it does, both in terms of good employment, but really how it serves our nation. For better or for worse, the overwhelming mood of Congress today is comprised either A, of people who don't understand the problem, B, don't care about the problem, or C, understand it quite well and actually want it to occur. And in some ways, that's really the most scary of all. There is now a significant minority in the United States Congress who actually wants there not to be a Postal Service. Do they want it because they like the idea of trying to destroy a large, powerful, successful labor union? I would say that's part of it. Do they fundamentally believe that the United States government shouldn't be in the business of doing good things, that we need to try to shrink the government out of existence because the very idea of a public sector is anathema to their ideology? Whatever the reason is, there is a significant minority who literally believe we shouldn't have a post office at all, and therefore they welcome its decline, and not only do they welcome it, they're doing everything they can to accelerate it. And they are not the majority today, and through your good work, at least for the moment, we're fighting them to a draw, but they are a significant minority, and they're not given up. And third, unfortunately, you have a management team who, while they're very good at many things, at the issue of reinventing and reimagining and fighting for this institution, they have thrown in the towel. This institution needs a new path. It needs people leading it who want and believe and know that it needs to reinvent itself to survive and thrive. Unfortunately, their vision, as we said in our paper that we shared with your leadership, their vision, unfortunately, is to shrink to survive. They seem to honestly believe that by degrading the network, by reducing collective bargaining rights, by reducing convenience for customers, by reducing frequency, that the Postal Service can have a future. Now, anybody who has studied even a little bit of basic network economics or has participated in any kind of restructuring of a troubled institution knows that that is a dead-end strategy, that will only accelerate the very problem that the institution faces. But in fact, that is the plan. The plan is to shrink to survive. So you have a set of external economics, the decline of first class. You have let's call it a board of directors of 535 men and women who, as I said, either don't get it, don't care, or want it to happen. And you have a management who's thrown in the towel. So things are looking pretty good. The future, as I said, on that trajectory is very, very bleak. What do we have to do to stop it? What does it take? Let's start with the strengths that the Post Office has, because while the weaknesses and the bad news is very significant, we are not without tools. We are not at a place where it is inevitable. It is, as I said, inevitable if action is not taken. Right now, the default option, right now, the forces of inertia are leading to extinction, but it doesn't have to be that way. What does the Postal Service have? First thing, let's take a real look at the crisis. I will not in any way try to varnish for you how significant the long-term crisis is. This institution is going out of business. But it is not going out of business today. It is only going out of business today because the Congress wants it to. The crisis of today is not about the long-term decline. In the first 8 months of the year, the Postal Service lost $10 billion. And if you were reading a casual reader of media accounts, you probably would have thought it was twice that much, because it's hard to pick up a newspaper without hearing $2 billion in a month. Well, in fact, the number is $10 billion over 8 months, which is plenty bad. 94% of that loss had nothing to do with delivering the mail. 94% of that loss was either the pre-funding mandate, completely a creation of Congress, which no other company in the public or private sector needs to bear, or accounting changes driven by the extremely low interest rate that causes the Postal Service to change its workers' comp expense, not having anything to do with how many people get hurt on the job or what their benefits are when they get hurt, frequency or the lifespan or anything else like that, just having to do with interest rate changes, which will almost certainly reverse themselves in the period ahead. So only 6% of the loss had actually anything to do with delivering the mail. Now, we shouldn't sneeze at losses of that level. It is still a lot of money. The Postal Service on its current trajectory will lose almost $1 billion from delivering the mail this year. But there is a big difference between losing $1 billion a year and losing $1 billion or $2 a month, which is what the average consumer of the news, if they simply read the headlines or even the stories, would have you believe. So in fact, there is time. In fact, we face a manufactured crisis that is being used for political objectives. But it's succeeding. And the dilemma with this manufactured crisis is it is causing people to act, and act in a way that will accelerate the real crisis. So when the manufactured crisis comes, and we are told that the Postal Service is losing $20 billion a year, then the right thing to do is to do anything you can to survive, to essentially engage in amputations, because you got to try to save something. And if indeed the Postal Service were losing $20 billion from delivering the mail, that would be the right thing to do. Cut as fast and as hard as you can and just pray that it works. But that's not what it is, but that's how we're acting. And so we're degrading the network. We're setting in motion the changes that will make that $20 billion be the real loss from operations in 5 or 10 years, because that is what it will be. It will be that way partly because of the decline of first class, and partly because indeed, if we degrade the network fast enough, we can drive the customers out of this system. So while today's crisis is manufactured, it is manufactured itself into a reality which is visiting itself on the future of the Postal Service. But it seems to me we at least have an obligation to speak the truth and to observe, in no way suggesting that the long-term crisis is not real, but to observe and to remind people that the short-term crisis is about mandates that no private or public company has, or accounting changes, not delivering the mail. Second, opportunity. This is still today an extraordinary network. It is the densest network in our country and in the world. For a population as spread out as America, this is the densest network in the world. This network hits 150 million addresses 6 days a week. Nothing else comes even remotely close. And while it is true that first-class mail is in long-term decline, and I will not argue the other side of that for a minute, there is no reason why this network can't be filled with other things. Just as in 1912, the Postal Service was given the opportunity to deliver packages, there are many, many products that cannot be reduced to electronic form. So while Amazon does not deliver books or music by the mail particularly anymore, they want to sell you everything else that's in your house. And e-commerce provides an enormous opportunity to take this dense network, to take the extraordinary brand that the Postal Service brings, the trust and reliability that it has, the value proposition that its customers believe in, and fill that network with new products. So there is an opportunity for growth. In that same 8-month period, when the Postal Service was struggling to break even and losing money for delivering the mail in the whole, shipping services, which is sort of everything else other than first class and standard, was up by 21%. Now, I don't know if that growth trajectory can continue, but that's not bad, and it's certainly not bad when the guys in charge aren't really trying to make it happen. So almost despite itself, the Postal Service is revealing that in fact the network is still a thing of extraordinary value. But at the same time, as I said, there are those who are trying to cut it off. And third, and most importantly, the Postal Service has you. In the end, whether or not the Postal Service survives and is restructured successfully really does rest on your shoulders. And the question really is, will this union take the bull by the horns and lead the effort to reimagine, restructure, and revitalize the United States Postal Service? What does a restructuring of the Postal Service look like? What would a new Postal Service look like? I keep doing things in threes. 3 pieces to it. 1, financial. There will need to be shared sacrifice. And again, I don't want to sugarcoat this, but I would urge you, I'm your advisor, so I have obviously no authority, but I would urge you to empower your leaders to take a hard look at your collective bargaining agreements. Not because anything you have is not fair, not because anything you have wasn't hard fought, not because in any way, shape, or form you're overpaid or underworked, but because the fundamental reality is your employer's going out of business. And from both a political and economic perspective, labor needs to be a part of the solution. And that is going to take tough and difficult decisions with people who rightly say to you as their leaders, what did I do? I did everything I was asked. I delivered the mail, I got to work on time, I left work on time, I delivered the mail, I kept my nose clean, and now you're telling me that something I was given that barely got me into the middle class is not deserved. And they are right. They are right. You don't have a good answer for that other than if we don't do it, if we don't lead this, it will not happen, and the result will be dramatically worse. So labor does need to be a part of it, but at the same time, I would tell you, and I would counsel you to make very difficult and painful changes. But I would also tell you at the same time, if it's not part of a bigger package of shared sacrifice, it is completely in vain. It is completely in vain. So you need to give, but you need to give to get others to give. Because if others don't give, literally, number one, there's no amount you can give that will fix it. You can't give enough. And number two, it just offends the basic sensibility to suggest that an institution can be restructured on the backs of only one stakeholder. That's never, ever a successful path to a restructuring. So everyone needs to give. Labor needs to give. Customers need to give. In this entire discussion of saving the Postal Service, not once does anybody observe that we have the most affordable mail in the world. Now, I am not, and I would recommend you not be for raising postal rates. It's not something we want to happen. On the other hand, it doesn't seem unreasonable that if the institution is going out of business and labor is being asked and agreeing that they will make difficult changes, that we should ask the people who benefit from this service to pay for its full cost. That does not seem an unreasonable request. And so without arguing in particular for a rate setting of one sort or another, it's extraordinary to me it's not even on the table. And you have to put it on the table. Now, it's going to get a lot of people angry. The shippers are going to jump up and down and scream, you're going to hurt them. And you know what? From their perspective, they're right. From their perspective, why should they give? They've paid the rates the Postal Service has given them, and they've done it. And they've built their business around that. But they face the same problem you face, which is that if they don't give a little something now, in concert again with a broader plan, there's not going to be a Postal Service in a decade to deliver the packages they need delivered. And so you need to tell them the hard truth too, because everyone has to participate. And finally, the Congress has to do its part. And here, different than General Motors, you don't need any money. You need absolutely no taxpayer money. All you need is what is already rightfully yours. But you got to go get it. But you got to go get it. Because rightful as your cause is, and obvious as the numbers are, whether it's relieving the pre-funding obligation, getting the FERS surplus or the CSRS surplus, as right and clear in black and white as those truths, they're not happening now. That's not what's going on. And so while you don't need a dime of taxpayers' money, you do need to set the books straight. You do need to get what's rightfully yours. Because without that, without relieving the pre-funding burden and getting these surpluses, again, a plan can't come together. So first, there needs to be a financial restructuring, and everybody needs to participate. Second, we need to reimagine the regulatory and oversight structure of the United States Postal Service. And I don't know, and I don't know anybody knows exactly where that leads, but I would argue to you that, again, the status quo ain't working. And so I think the union is better off in an environment where the Postal Service is given the freedom to be run like a business and to compete in the marketplace. Right now, the Postal Service has the worst of both worlds. You're told to make money, or at least to break even, on the one side, and then you're told that you can't act like a business. You can't raise prices, no matter how underpriced your service is. You can't compete. You can't do strategic pricing as any business would. You can't have any real conversation about running it like a business. You put a burden on it with a pre-funding that nobody else bears, and then you're told, gee, this is really surprising, the thing's failing. So I would argue, with that worst of both worlds, I would argue you're way better off facing it head on and saying, look, give us the real freedom to compete. Give us a regulatory structure where we're overseen by businessmen and women who want to win, and we'll go out and we'll do okay. Finally, you need a leadership who wants to win. To update the charge against our nation's first postmaster, the Postal Service needs leaders who would proudly want to be charged with actions sympathetic to the Postal Service. How do we get there? How do we get there? Well, it really does. It comes down to you. Someday, someone will write the definitive history of the United States Postal Service. And when they come to the chapter about the crisis at the second decade of the 21st century, the question will be whether that moment marks the beginning of the end of the Postal Service, when the Postal Service began its long slide to oblivion, or will it be the moment when the National Association of Letter Carriers stood up and grabbed the wheel and said, we will write our own history. We will stand up and save the United States Postal Service. Thank you. Can I have 2 more minutes? Thank you.
When you were talking earlier and they started clapping when you were drinking, yesterday they learned that when I'm thirsty, they clap. So you took a drink, that's why they started clapping. And then you got in tune with it.
You're very kind, but unfortunately your kindness is going to be rewarded by you're going to have to listen to me for 2 more minutes. I said to Fred, could I have 2 more minutes? Yeah. So I told you that when I went to work at the SEIU, my buddy who hired me said, you're a loudmouth, you're a smartass, and you don't back down. So I tried to make the speech at least light at moments, but I really now want to share with my true inner self, which is my smartass. So these three guys are going through the forest in and there's a Frenchman, an Englishman and a member of the NALC. And they're set upon by savages. And the savages grab them and take them to their central location there and say, we're going to kill you, and we're going to skin you and use your skin as canoes. But because we're decent savages, we're going to let you decide how to die. So they turn to the Englishman, and he says, okay. And he says, I would like a gun. And they hand him a gun. He says, God save the Queen, and he blows his brains out. They then turn to the Frenchman, and they say, what would you like? And he said, I'd like a knife. So they give him a knife, goes up to his throat, says, Vive la France, and cuts his throat. They then say to the NALC guy, they say, what would you like? He says, I'd like a fork. He says, you'd like a fork? He says, yeah, I want a fork. So they give him a fork, grabs the fork. Screw your canoe! Thank you.